Financial advising is one of the few careers where you can still grow socioeconomically above your parents. There aren't a lot of them. And this being one of them, you have to face some of that baggage. And so I'll hear some of my clients say, well, concierge, that doesn't mean that much to me. Well, I get that. But for you to go into these wealth markets you want to pursue, you need to pay attention to your own boundaries, your own bumpers, if you will. And so these are things that we work on when we're coaching clients to help them so that they can get to a point where they can even accept what wealth means. And that there are some things like going to the front of the line, or as I call it, using the Disney Fast Pass, that you're okay with doing it.
Welcome, Model FAs. David DeSalle here, president of Model FA and your host of the Model FA podcast. We have a good friend of mine joining today, Phil Bender. Phil and I knew each other in our prior life, and he is an executive coach who once was managing partner of a financial services firm, and he owns the company Sea Captain Coaching. I was actually just on Phil's podcast a couple weeks back. I'm sure Phil will talk about that podcast and where you can find that later on in the show. But he is returning the favor and becoming a guest on our podcast. And we have a lot that we're going to talk through today, ranging anywhere from the concept of concierge financial planning, not having a CEO mindset in your practice. I find a lot of times advisors get into the business to be advisors, help people have an impact, be in control of your income, and of course, have your independence in your schedule and your life and things like that. And then one day there's this inflection point where you're like, oh crap, I actually have a business. So curious to unpack that side of the conversation. And then lastly, talking about elevating your brand standard and achieving peak performance. But with that being said, Phil, welcome to the show.
Wow. I don't know if we need to do much more than that. You covered it all. And I feel a little bit obligated here, to return this favor after you did such a nice job on our podcast, the Sea Captain way. So it's great to be with you. I've admired what you've done from a distance at this point, professionally, but personally, we've been connecting quite a bit.
Appreciate it. And yeah, we live a couple cities away from each other when you do spend time in Florida. And that kind of leads me to my first question that I actually didn't mention in that brief overview. Sea Captain Coaching.
Yeah.
I would imagine you're a boater. What is the significance of the Sea Captain Coaching name to your firm?
Well, the Sea Captain Coaching, first of all, I am not a boater. I am a friends with boater.
Oh, so you're smart.
I am a smart guy.
That's a different way of saying smart.
Yeah, and Sea Captain, everybody teases me about it because boating gives me more stress than releases for me. But Sea Captain started actually when I was a managing partner. I had an office up in Connecticut. It was on the Long Island Sound, along the Westport, Stamford area, Fairfield County. And we had a lot of nautical themes in the office. We decorated nautical. It was kind of a cool thing. And then I used to do a newsletter called the Sea Captain's Log. And I would just recognize people, talk about relevant topics. And we had about 250 advisors and their teams in our organization. And so people started calling me Sea Captain periodically, and people who got the newsletter would call me that. So when I transitioned out to start this executive coaching firm, Sea Captain was a natural progression. I live half the year in Newport, Rhode Island now, so that's a sea area. But the real driving force of Sea Captain Coaching is visionary success, unlimited horizons, the pursuit of unlimited horizons. And our tag is navigating the uncharted water of personal and professional growth. So that's really the basis of Sea Captain, is that visionary life, that creation of something beyond ourselves. And a financial advisory practice is a great example.
Love it. Yeah, I've always been curious about that. So selfishly wanted to ask that to get us kickstarted.
You bet.
But into some of the topics that we're going to unpack, when we had our call to scope this out, you had talked about a concept called concierge financial planning. So I'm curious on two things. One, when you say concierge financial planning, what do you mean by that? And then more specifically, because I want to make sure folks get some tactical takeaways from this episode.
Sure.
What does that actually look like in its full form?
Well, it's a great question. And a lot of it started when I hit my 50s. All of a sudden, the plumbing that God gave me doesn't seem to work like it used to. Okay. And so as you get older, I'm 58 now. As you get older, you start to realize, okay, I am in a health position where I should start paying attention. So I had my brother, who's fine. He had a mild heart attack at 51 and got me thinking, along with the other issues, because when you're in your 50s, David, you haven't experienced this yet, is every time something goes wrong, you think you're going to die. It's not you wonder if you're going to, you think you're going to. And so I started to say, okay, let me start being proactive with my health. And I started interviewing concierge physicians. And in doing so, I noticed I had to pay an upfront fee. Okay. They spent an incredible amount of time getting my file together. I probably spent an hour and a half just getting my health file together because everything up to that point was reactive. The nurses did most of the work at 5 to 7 minutes with my physician, and they really didn't have a vested interest in me. And so concierge became this metaphor for me of, holy cow, as I'm listening to this person take all this time, has a proactive plan set up for me to get to the place that I want to get to, and it's challenging me in goals. There's a frequency of contact. The service level is different. I have direct access to this physician. All of a sudden, I started realizing, God, that's eerily familiar to me. And how is it familiar? Because that's really what financial planning is. It was like sitting down with a concierge, financial planning. So we tend to think that financial planning on a concierge level is putting a plan together itself, charging a fee for it, possibly, those types of things. But actually, concierge financial planning is the client experience. What is the client experience you as an advisor are providing your client? Is it beyond just a computer-generated plan with some updates periodically? Or is it a real experience like it is with my physician? And so that's the basis of really the first section of my book, which is deals with that particular element.
It's interesting that you bring that up, Phil. So I went through a similar journey of yours where seeing doctors, my whole life for annual checkups, and just I'm very punctual. So, I would get there at least, 5 or 10 minutes early, and then they had me in the waiting room for an additional 20, 25 minutes. And I'm like, well, what was the point of booking this appointment? And then, like you said, the nurse spends most of the time, and then you spend 5 or 7, minutes with the doctor. So I actually sought out a concierge doctor as well.
Oh, okay.
Whom I now work with. And maybe this kind of bleeds into some of the experience components that can be provided by you as what this looks like in full form. But there was 2 things in addition to what you said, right? You said 90 minutes, first time getting together, things like that. But what was interesting is there's 2 examples. One is this doctor happens to have a podcast himself. And when I was made aware of this doctor, I Googled around, I saw on his website, and I listened to probably, 5 or 6 episodes that were probably 30 minutes each. So call it, I spent like 3 hours with him from afar in a leveraged manner from his perspective. So the first time we got together, I spent about an hour with him. And that was just like an introductory meeting. Like we didn't even get into the full 90-minute session. And At the end, he's like, here's how it works. And here's the contract, take it and, think about if this is something that you want to do. And I was like, Dr. Tommy, like, I already listened to a handful of your podcasts. Like I wouldn't have reached out if I wasn't ready to move forward. I'll just sign it. And he's like, really? And I said, yes, like your podcast is exactly what I teach my clients to do. And it works, right? We're saving a step here, together. And then lastly, not saying that every financial advisor necessarily wants to do this, but it totally blew me away. I had this instance actually in Rhode Island where I fainted for the first time in my life on a Saturday night after dinner. And first thing in the morning, Sunday, 7 o'clock, I called my doctor just to talk to him about it, to figure out if there was anything, that he could shed some light on. Then at 7 o'clock in the morning, he answered. I was expecting to leave a voicemail and say, hey, call me back on Monday when you're in the office. But he answered. And I was like, damn, like this is really cool. So those are a couple examples that I experienced on what that actual delivery looks like. What are some things that you can share in that same vein?
Well, I think you're touching on some of them. That there is a deeper relationship, number one. Okay, there is a relationship. My doctor last year said, do you want to be 60 years old and weigh 260 pounds? Okay. Now, I'm not portly by any stretch. I take up a lot of space, though. And so, I said no. And so I lost 20 pounds last year. Now, would I have lost that if I weren't paying that $5,000 that I'm paying that concierge physician? Maybe not. So, first thing is accountability. And that is a responsibility that I have to take care of myself now because I'm, in some cases, paying a fee. When it comes to accountability coaching, which we do a lot of, the accountability coaching, you either have to respect the hell out of the person you're talking to, or you got to pay them. Mm-hmm. Think like a personal trainer. So part of it is just behavioral. And so that's a key piece. Second piece is he only takes 200 clients. So not everybody's going to be a target or a person to do this concierge level care. So that's another piece to consider. Who shares the same core values as I do? Who shares the same mission? Who wants this type of work done? And there's some discovery that goes into that as well, because it necessarily doesn't mean your biggest revenue client. It could just be a client that you share like core values. So there's a lot of layers to this, but the other piece is this world-class service or this experience that you're trying to provide here that starts out with something you would want if you were in that position, because wealthy people will pay more for extra attention. Now, I've been blessed in my career to have accumulated some wealth. I will pay more to get certain things done because either I'm not an expert in it, I don't care to do it, or I'm scared to death about it, which health becomes one of those examples. And so when you're prospecting or developing new clients, this is a key strategy to separate yourself from the pack. And so it's also a good thought from a strategic point of view.
Yeah. And you're making me think of more examples. Like there was a topic that my doctor and I were discussing, and I didn't even ask him to do this, but I got an email from him on my drive home. So it was probably within 10 or 15 minutes of leaving his office. And he followed up with a podcast that he did on that topic and a third-party blog or article, whatever you want to call it, on that same topic as well. And I was just like, this is exactly what I was looking for. And to your point about people being willing to pay for extra attention, even something as silly as, and I'm sure you do something like this as well, but if I go to a restaurant and I really like the restaurant, let's say it's my first time there, I'll tip egregiously.
Yeah, sure.
That very first time, and I'll go out of my way to, build a relationship with the host. And, even there was a restaurant I went to in St. Petersburg where I asked to meet the owner. And then immediately you become a regular. And then every single time you go there moving forward, you're treated differently. And my point is, when an advisor can provide that level of experience to make someone feel special, you don't have conversations around what the fee is. You don't have conversations around what they're paying for. It's a totally different dynamic. And it's something that I think every advisor should strive for.
Yeah. And there are some direct benefits to the advisor to go through this exercise, because some of the boundaries are from the advisor's upbringing where they weren't raised in wealth. And so to consider looking at concierge goes beyond some of the spectrum of how they were raised. They've got to let go of some things, and that is how they were raised or what their past is like. Because financial advising is one of the few careers where you can still grow socioeconomically above your parents. There aren't a lot of them. And this being one of them, you have to face some of that baggage. And so I'll hear some of my clients say, well, concierge, that doesn't mean that much to me. Well, I get that. But for you to go into these wealth markets you want to pursue, you need to pay attention to your own boundaries, your own bumpers, if you will. And so these are things that we work on when we're coaching clients to help them so that they can get to a point where they can even accept what wealth means. And that there are some things like going to the front of the line, or as I call it, using the Disney Fast Pass, that you're okay with doing it.
Yeah. One thing I want to say before I transition topics here is my managing partner, when I was newer in the business, I come from very modest, beginnings, super loving family, but financially modest. And I never experienced those things, as you just, mentioned. And I remember this really irked me when my managing partner said this, but it was outstanding advice looking back. He said, you need to get out of your bubble of Haverhill, where you grew up. Like, you just need to get out of it. Like, go and spend a couple nights at the Ritz. Just experience it. Like, go spend money for these experiences so you can be exposed to what that's like. And I did that. And I'm like, I really like this. It was a really neat experience. And it just opened up my mind to what additional wealth can provide and what wealthy people come to expect based on the other things that they're doing, in their life. So I remember it irked me when he shared it, but it really benefited me.
Yeah. I had so little money, David, in college that you roomed with me. You got my desk lamp and my personality. That was all I could provide my room. Okay. So it was a challenge. There's a lot of stories that take me 6 beers to get through probably before we get through it, but that's it. And so some of it is behavioral on our own and not just what we want to provide clients. So anyway, good stuff.
My college story that I'll share is on Thursdays, if I'd go out to the bar right near campus, I did a work study program and I would get paid on Fridays. But by Thursday, like, pretty much all the money was gone. So what I would do is I would just leave the bar. My card would, be on file. I'd get paid overnight and I'd go back Friday during the day to close the tab, knowing that there was now money, in the account that Friday. That's how little money I had at that point in time.
Exactly. You conveniently forgot your tab, right?
Exactly.
We could spend the rest of the time on this alone, but I think that puts a bow on Concierge.
Cool. Let's talk about the CEO mindset, in your practice. As I teed it up before, there's this inflection point that I find advisors come to where they're like, wow, I actually have a business and there's human capital, there's rent, there's technology, there's all these things. Let's talk about, that CEO mindset.
Well, I think there's some obvious elements of CEO mindset, then there are some behavioral pieces. Okay. In other words, most advisors are not taught how to run firms. They don't go to a Harvard School of Management or any of these things. They're paid to survive, do things, go out and make rain and not worry about anything else. But what happens, especially when you get about to the 5th year and you've now survived, now all of a sudden you got to start making some decisions. How do I invest in my practice? How do I grow this thing? Do I partner now? That's a big piece. Do I partner with somebody? Who do I hire and how? And, what's the best way to hire people? And I'll admit, your whole audience might not like this, but financial advisors are a pretty self-absorbed group. Mm-hmm. Okay. And what I mean by that is it's all about them. Now, is that a bad thing? No, that's what actually helped them survive all the no's and not nows and not yets that they got in the first 5 years. So they're now at a place where they got to pay attention. It's like having kids. You got to start paying attention to someone other than you. And in doing so, they have poor muscle built up for this type of behavior. And they end up burning through people that they hire. Retention rates with team members is terribly low. We devote a whole section of what we do called growing team talent just to focus on this piece. And that is that, retention is a challenge everywhere. We talk about the transfer portal right now in basketball, football, and other sports, but Indeed is the transfer portal for business. Okay. If somebody doesn't like what they see, they go to Indeed and immediately, where are they? They've got 6 different offers right now. So what does an advisor need to do in order to run their firm? Obviously, there's training, but there's also behavioral change. I have to start paying attention to the people that I work with and paying attention to not only what they do for me or do for the firm, but what they do for themselves. And for example, what are their core values? What's their vision? I have this phrase I use all the time, which says, if a team member can achieve their vision within your vision, they have no reason to ever leave. So think about that for a second. That's a pretty powerful piece of this. Okay. Now, in addition to that, we also have this issue of, should I even be a CEO? Okay. I have two models that I teach to. One is a CEO where I want to call all the shots. And then maybe I hire a team below that or with that. And then I have a president's model, which suggests you're hiring a CEO or a COO, somebody to run the day-to-day because you're just not wired for it. So most financial advisors are optional behavior. That's a whole nother segment we could talk about. In other words, their behavior is, I want to be in relationships. I want to be out making things happen. I don't like detail orientation and follow through. So with a chief executive, that can be a real challenge. So what we do is we work with first to determine what the person is wired to do and accepting the fact that that might not be CEO. Then we start working with building that infrastructure around them so that they can go do what their three priorities are, what they were put on this earth to do. Then from that, help them build out their infrastructure and then become the leader, potentially, not the CEO in their firm. I'll stop there because it's probably a good stopping point, but that's sort of it in an overarching perspective.
Yeah, there's three things. One that I want to emphasize that you shared, and then two things to build off of what you just stated. So to emphasize, advisors need to go from looking out for themselves and their clients to looking out for their team and their clients and themselves. And, oftentimes, people think like clients are number one. Clients are very important, but once you have a team, your team is number one.
Right. That's right.
If you treat them that way and they feel that and they see that, then they're going to take the utmost care of your clients and they're going to be tied for number one. So that's one thing I would just wanted to emphasize.
Yep.
The other two things, and one of which I talked about on your podcast, when folks are building out teams, what do they enjoy doing? We call it an energy audit. So things that they're great at and they love to do, things that they're good at and they like to do, things that they're good at and they don't like to do, and then things that they're bad at and they don't like to do. And the whole point is to make sure that they're only spending their time. Each person on the team is only spending their time in the top two quadrants, things that they're good and great at that they like or love to do. And we coincide or couple that, I should say, with their advisor DNA. How are they wired, to your point?
Yep.
And then lastly, we help bring them through a system, which I'm sure you're familiar of, the book Traction and the EOS system, as a tool to help them run the business so that they don't have to recreate systems and structures and things like that to hit various objectives within the company. So I think we're aligned well in growing the firm and making sure, I think this was John Gordon, making sure that, people are in the right seats on the bus.
Yeah. Yes. John Gordon. In fact, I'm rereading Rocket Fuel right now. So they talk about visionaries and instigators, right? Integrators.
The visionaries are the instigators.
Yeah. Instigators used to be what you and I were, right? But yeah, the visionary actually is that. So yeah, these are pieces. So just to add a little more depth on this, there are three reasons why people leave your firm. And one of them is not comp. In fact, comp's number 4. So if we're playing Family Feud, number one answer is unpredictable work environment, unpredictable advisor. Advisors that blow off meetings for clients instead of having their team meetings, or are constantly, moving stuff around because good procedural people can't sleep at night if their cheese gets moved. And so if you're an advisor moving it all day, you're going to lose the good people. Now, here's the thing. Or number 2 is culture, of course. Pretty obvious. The third one is lack of a growth plan. They just don't know where they fit. And so if you add those 3 pieces together, 4 is comp. But here's what when they come in their exit interview, first thing they say is, I'm leaving because I just got offered more money. And so most advisors go, well, I just couldn't compete with the money. No, they picked their head up because of the other 3.
That makes sense.
And that's the piece that we don't spend enough time and as advisors, we're wired, and this is a good thing, we're wired to be resilient. So we just don't press on that. We don't push on that piece. And we end up just repeating the same process over and over again. The last piece with being a CEO that I find is a real struggle, and this is something my wife does very well. When she buys something new, she puts it in the closet, she takes something else out. Now, I'm not going down the path of how much she puts in the closet. I'm not going to have that conversation with you guys today. But I will tell you this, that one of the great gifts is that her closet is always clear. And what CEOs don't do, or advisors don't do, is when they put something in the closet, they become resentful because they just don't let anything else go. And they're still trying to control every element of their day. And they're looking over people, they're meddling, they're constantly resistant instead of trusting the people around them. And so a lot of our CEO discussion is about just behavioral patterns that cause us these types of struggles.
I agree with all that. My biggest takeaway is your wife and my girlfriend need to meet because we are running out of closet space.
Yeah, she would be helpful.
Let's talk about elevating your brand standard.
Yep.
Is that purely branding? Are you alluding to certain marketing strategies as well? Help me understand what you mean about elevating a brand standard.
Well, the answer is yes to all those, but I'm going to take a different tact I think might be unique to what you might hear normally.
Cool.
But to run down that path, we talked about Concierge, elevating that brand standard, right? Standard of care, standard of service, standard of all this and that, right? So that's important. And that's often done. The other piece, of course, is image consulting. What does that look like so that you can separate yourself? One of the things we work on is who you are matters more than what you know. Because when you get to the top of the food chain, everybody's got CFPs. Mm-hmm. Okay. So who you are matters more than what you know at that level. How do you separate yourself based on core values and mission? What's that client experience look like? Which we talked a little bit about earlier. But when I talk about elevating brand standard, I'm talking about how you reinforce the brand within your team, within your organization. Okay. Because one of the things that I notice most often is, and one of my dear friends, top advisor, Barron's caliber advisor, says, I don't want my core values to be words on a wall. And I think that's a powerful statement because so many times that's what the rest of the team really understand, the root of the core values, the origin of it, all these different pieces. Do they understand that, or is it just words on a wall? So is the mission just words on a wall? So brand standard is in every agenda. When I coach to people putting together agendas for clients, for team meetings, for every event, that at the top is the branding, but then after that is the core values, vision, and mission of the firm. Then the goals of the client or the goals of the firm. So every meeting starts with that cadence. And when they start with that cadence, David, what they end up doing is they start to say, oh, okay, if I have a conflict, then all I have to do is look back at the top of the page, because core values are the ground rules for how you operate. When you're at a baseball game, you go out there and the umpire's out at home plate and you see the two managers come out, they go over the ground rules, right? They don't say, this is kind of a foul ball. They say, this is foul, this is fair. So core values are really that. So brand standard is what we expect within our firm, our conduct, our care, our clients that respect that and appreciate that about us, and how far down the firm hierarchy does it go? Now, dude, I'd love to tell you that when I was running a firm, I was as clear and as good at it as I'm explaining it right now. I can't say that. This is tough stuff. But what it does do is then decision-making is not about the advisor, the president of the company. Decision-making is about the firm itself. If I say to my team, David, what we did today was not at brand standard. If I say that to my team, they get rattled because I might say that 2 to 3 times a year, which means we're not living up to Sea Captain standard. That's elevating brand standard, in my opinion.
Yeah, I was totally thinking you were going to be talking about logos and taglines. I think that's an excellent take on that. And it's interesting because some of the coaching that we provide. So last year, as you're aware of, I got my SEPA designation, and we help advisors with increasing their firm's value through their intangible assets, as well as their tangible assets, and increasing revenue and things like that. But there's a lot of intangible assets. And what's interesting about how you just articulated that is when the core values are so strong, a certain type of culture is created. And when that owner is removed through retirement, or if, they pass away, or, whatever the scenario is, that culture can live on, and that's valuable to whoever takes over the business, assuming that they do what it takes to reinforce it. But it's incredibly valuable because you've created something that can live beyond you just being there, or just you being there, I should say.
Yeah. And so many advisors now that are going through, succession and looking at valuation. Okay. Valuation goes beyond just the assets being transferred. And, is this a brand that can be transferable, where others can run it, where it doesn't feel like it's all about the mom and pop that are opened up the store every day? So you couldn't be more right on this point. All of these things about elevating brand are also wildly profitable in the eventual sale of your practice.
100%. Last topic.
Yep.
And I'm going to try my best to bite my tongue because I can go off on tangents because I love this topic around personal development and achieving peak performance. And I've talked on this podcast, I've talked on your podcast about how we help advisors and people in general, do this and work towards peak performance. But I'm going to be quiet because I want to know how you help folks with this, or how you think through how to achieve peak performance.
Well, again, I'd love to be the person out front that says, boy, I have lived peak performance my entire career. I know a lot of people claim that. I cannot. And what I mean by that is there are parts of me that I am disciplined in. There are parts of me where I'm responsible. And then there are parts of me where I'm accountable. And so if I analyze discipline for all of us, if we're talking about peak performance, okay, do I have a discipline in it? And I always use this example of running wind sprints, okay? If when you were back in high school, you ran your wind sprints regardless of whether the coach was there or not, you were disciplined. If you ran your wind sprints because the coach made you the captain, you're responsible. If you ran your wind sprints because the team needed you, and that if they weren't around, you wouldn't run them at all, you were accountable. And so what I work on is helping people understand their wiring. Okay. Are they a procedural person, which is easier for discipline? Are they optional like me, where I need structure? And so if I give you an example, I am disciplined in one area. This is outside of personal hygiene, brushing teeth, and that kind of thing. Okay. I am disciplined in being on time. When you work with me, I will always be on time. And if I'm not, I get anxious. I'll call you ahead of time if I even think it's going to happen. It is rare 2 to 3 times a year where I miss anything. And it has a lot to do with when I was raised. When my dad would take me to ball practice, I was a catcher, and I would forget my cup, if I can say this on your podcast.
You can.
Okay. And David, he would yell at me all the way home and all the way back to practice because he was the coach and we were going to be late. So I am always on time. I'm always present, and I am always prepared. Okay. So that's a discipline. You don't have to do anything for that to happen. When you look at responsibility, that's where the sea captain lives. That means that I will do for you before I do for myself. And so I need to structure my day as best I can for peak performance by creating a calendar where I have to show up for others, clients, team members, friends. When you need the sea captain, you can count on it. And that's responsibility. I take that on. Accountability, don't do much of that. I don't coach much to it because I think unless you're paying for it, as I said earlier, or you respect the hell out of the person you're with, I don't want to put responsibility on anybody else to hold me accountable. And so when you get clear in those elements, okay, then all of a sudden you will start to sustain peak performance over longer periods of time. And because I can think of about 5 times in my life where I was at peak performance. And by the way, I'm in one of those right now. Building my coaching brand, I am in that zone. I've come to know that zone about 4 other times. A lot of people will say, well, I was, and this is real, it was for me, when I was in high school, I was in a peak performance moment. Or when I first started in the business as an advisor, I was in a peak performance period. Well, right now, this is one of those for me. And I will tell you that I am focused, I'm present, and clear in what the vision, mission, and objectives need to be done. But I still have to set my calendar so that I will show up for the people that might get left behind. Okay. Like you have to wash me on my car sometimes because when it comes to running errands, I can get so focused that I don't even pay attention to that stuff. So I'll stop there because, again, that is a little different take on peak performance. It's not just getting up every day and saying, I'm going to win. I'm going to win. I'm good with that. I love people that do that, but that's not how most of we mere mortals are wired.
Yeah. And I think, too, a lot of times, I know I've succumbed to this plenty of times throughout my life, but we read a book or we listen to a podcast, about personal development or peak performance, and we, try and do, and, to our credit, we implement what we learned, but it wasn't sustainable, or we didn't follow through on it, or whatever it is. And I think the important thing to note, whether it's the situation and thought process that you just shared, or if it's the C3 list that I shared on your podcast, or it's Andy Frisella's power list, or it's, oh goodness, I just had another one in my mind, but I forget. I'm not going to share whose it was because I don't want them to know that I forgot what theirs is called. But my point is, there's plenty of lists. There's plenty of ways to structure your day. There's plenty of different ways to track your time or affirmations to share. And I think what I've learned is you just need to test and try and find something that when you do it, it doesn't necessarily seem like a chore, but it gives you energy and it creates momentum. And if it's not doing that for you, then obviously look in the mirror and make sure that you're actually doing what you're supposed to. And if you are and it's not serving you, that's fine. Try something else that may be a better fit. But there's so many different options out there of how to achieve peak performance. I think this was one of the points you were making, figuring out how you're wired and what's going to serve you, and finding that thing that complements that is of the utmost importance.
And it could be in something very difficult. I heard a reel the other day, which I thought was excellent. It says was talking about passion. And I can't remember who it was, but they were talking about passion. And they said, follow your passion is not good advice for somebody young. Do something well. Do something to the point where you become an expert in it is. And I thought about that and I was like, I didn't grow up. I didn't wake up when I was 11 years old. One of my buddies, terrific leader within the company he used to work with, he is a terrific leader. And he always tells a story about how when everybody else was 8 years old, they wanted to be baseball players and firemen. He wanted to sell insurance. Mm-hmm. And it's the biggest crock of crap, right? And everybody laughs at it. But the fact is, how many people on this podcast grew up saying that they were going to do financial advising when they were 10 years old? Okay. Not a lot. Maybe if your parent was doing it, maybe something like that. So my whole point here, David, is that we become good at things we choose to be good at. We master them. And in fact, mastery is one of the main causes of stopping peak performance, interestingly enough. We become so good at it, we get tired of it.
Yeah.
Right.
And we got to shake it up.
And we got to grow again. We got to reinvent. It's the thing that I like most about my relationship with you is every time we're on a call, you got some new initiative or some new project that you're into and that you're always innovative that way. That energizes me because it gets me thinking, but it also gets me to a place of saying, these are people that I want to be around. Okay. And just because you're a young man and I'm an old man, okay, doesn't mean that we can't still have these discussions. And that's what I enjoy. And so peak performance, boy, we have it 5-6 times in our lives where everything we touch turns to gold is really, really special. It doesn't have to be forever.
Yeah. And I feel like we could keep chatting and turn this into a very long and very valuable podcast, but to come full circle, I know that we've discussed about getting together now that you're spending more time. I think you're in Florida or will be in Florida.
Yep.
But we can't do dinner or lunch. It's not enough time. So you have a friend that has access to a boat. So we'll have to, take the boat out. So we have more time to spend with each other. You and I will talk shop, have fun. Your wife, my girlfriend, can talk about cleaning out the closet and it'll be a productive boat day.
Yeah.
But real quick, before we do wrap up, one of the things that I ask all of our guests, and it's our way of distilling a reading list for our audience is a book that's had an impact on them. And the book that, you told me about beforehand by, I think it's Paul Donahue, Are You Really Listening? Why'd you pick that book?
Well, I picked it because it's off the grid, for one. Like I said, 12-week year, I'm a big fan of Rocket Fuel, Traction. All these pieces are fantastic. Atomic Habits, these are all great books. But the one that I was off the grid was I worked with a coach for 15 years, part therapist, part listening coaching, wrote a book called Are You Really Listening? And it's by Dr. Paul Donahue and Mary Siegel. And what Paul taught me at a very critical part in my leadership life was that people, number one, the ability to listen is very difficult. Really listen. And we could do a whole podcast on this one. But the second piece is that most people, especially salespeople, think they're good listeners and they are not. And I learned the hard way as a leader, realizing that connecting was not listening. And so very powerful experience. Book is terrific. It's not a book to kind of kid around. It's not a book to take home to your spouse and say, I want you to read this, because you might get a whole can of whoop ass from your spouse. But if you can have that dialogue and practice those tenets that he preaches, especially the 4 non-listening behaviors, it's powerful. And it really built the basis or the structure for my coaching. So you'll notice when I coach, you'll notice those elements come out. So it's a good one if you want to pick it up.
Yeah, I actually haven't read it, and I will, but I would imagine one of the things that it talks about is a lot of people, until they refine the skill set, unless they're just naturally curious and whatnot, they listen to respond instead of listening to understand. That saying is always, not always, but has stuck with me last handful of years.
Yeah. And as you move up the food chain and you start running a firm, being a CEO, as I was a managing partner, most of the time when people had conflicts with me, they felt I wasn't present and I didn't get them and I wasn't listening to what they were trying to tell me most of the time, almost all.
So, Phil, I want to spend more time with you. If the folks listening agree with me, which I'm sure they do, where can they find you? Where can they connect with you? Where do you want to send them?
Well, it's seacaptaincoaching.com is our website, and that'll get you introduced to us. It's a very interactive site. But the Sea Captain Way, if you want to get more from a podcast perspective, okay, like you're getting here, the Sea Captain Way, it's on all the major podcast offerings. And those are probably the 2 biggest. And if you want to get me directly, Phil at seacaptaincoaching.com, and I'll chat with you. It's been a pleasure, my friend.
Likewise. I appreciate spending some time with you. I'm excited to spend some time in person and glad we were able to be on each other's podcasts, help elevate one another. So appreciate that.
I do too. You're doing a lot of great work for a lot of people. It was a pleasure.
Likewise. Take care.